The Zirin commander stood tall, exuding confidence from his sleek, bio-armored frame. A smirk, if his alien physiology even allowed for such an expression, played on his lips as he observed the feeble human resistance below. His forces marched through Earth's war-torn streets, their energy shields gleaming under the sunlight, deflecting bullets like raindrops against steel. Plasma rifles discharged with an eerie hum, reducing buildings to molten rubble. From their perspective, this wasn't a battle. It was a sport. A mere demonstration of superiority. Pathetic, Commander Vorik mused as he watched the human soldiers empty magazine after magazine into his troops, accomplishing nothing. The Zirins had conquered countless worlds, each one falling faster than the last, and Earth would be no different. He activated his universal translator and broadcasted his voice across all human frequencies. Surrender, humans! Your primitive weapons amuse us, but they serve no purpose. Throw them down, and we may yet offer you mercy. Silence followed. Then laughter, faint at first, then growing. Vorik's mandibles twitched in confusion. Who was laughing? Miles away, hidden in the shadows of a crumbling office tower, Sergeant Jack Holloway adjusted the scope of his rifle, his lips curling into a wry grin. He exhaled slowly, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The Zirins had no idea. They thought energy shields made them gods. But Jack? He'd spent his whole life finding ways to kill things that thought they were untouchable. He had a rule: if it bled, it could die. And right now, he was about to teach these oversized lizards a lesson they'd never forget. His crosshairs found their target. Not Vorik, not yet. That would be too easy. No, he needed to make a statement. His sights locked onto a Zirin officer, a smug bastard giving orders to his troops, standing tall like he owned the planet. Jack squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was barely a whisper in the wind, but the impact was thunderous. The Zirin officer's head snapped back, a fine mist of iridescent blue blood spraying into the air before his lifeless body collapsed. For the first time in recorded history, a Zirin warrior was felled by a human bullet. Pandemonium erupted. The once invincible alien warriors flinched, looking around in disbelief. Their shields had stopped tank shells, laser blasts, even orbital strikes. But a single, tiny metal projectile had slipped through like a ghost in the night and killed one of their own. Vorik's 4 eyes widened. His mind raced. This wasn't possible. This shouldn't be possible. Another shot rang out. Another officer crumpled. The Zirin troops, for the first time ever, hesitated. Their arrogance shattered in a heartbeat. Jack chambered another round, suppressing a chuckle. Oh, this is gonna be fun. The Zirin scrambled, their once coordinated movements turning into frantic chaos. Soldiers ducked behind cover that had never been necessary before. Shields flickered, recalibrating, but Jack had already moved. His sniper's nest was a ghost, never in the same place twice. He had spent years in war zones, learning how to become invisible. Against humans, the Zirins had the upper hand. Against him? They were out of their league. Vorik's mind reeled. Identify the attacker! He barked through his communicator. Where is the fire coming from? But there was no answer. His soldiers were too panicked, too disoriented. They were trained for full frontal dominance, not for unseen enemies picking them off like game animals. Impossible, he muttered under his breath. This is a trick. And yet the bodies piling up around him told a different story. Jack listened to the panicked chatter over intercepted comms, shaking his head in amusement. These aliens weren't so tough when they weren't the ones dictating the terms of battle. He adjusted his position, crawling over debris, staying low and invisible. He had no fancy cloaking devices, no technological advantages. Just patience, skill, and a rifle that didn't give a damn about their shields. From his vantage point, he could see their mistakes, how they grouped together, making them easier targets. How they searched for high-energy weapon signatures, not realizing his weapon had none. How they refused to believe, even as their comrades dropped one by one, that something so simple could be their undoing. Another officer fell. This time, a sniper shot clean through the throat. The Zirins didn't even know where to look. Vorik clenched his fists. He was a conqueror. A warlord. His empire had crushed civilizations that had weaponized entire planets. And now? He was being humiliated by a single soldier with an outdated rifle. "Deploy Seekers!" he roared. Immediately, mechanical drones lifted from the Zirin ranks, scanning for heat signatures, movement, anything that could lead them to their unseen adversary. Jack watched the drones rise, sighing. Finally, a challenge! He adjusted his aim, lined up a shot, and squeezed the trigger. The lead drone exploded midair, shrapnel raining down on the bewildered aliens. The second drone, thrown off by the blast, wobbled, just in time for Jack to put another round through its core. 2 shots. 2 kills. The remaining drones hesitated, recalibrating their scanning algorithms, but Jack had already relocated. He slid into an abandoned parking garage, disappearing into the darkness. Vorik seethed. "This is no ordinary soldier," he growled. He was right. Jack Holloway wasn't just any soldier. He was a relic from a time when wars weren't fought with satellites and AI targeting systems. He was a man trained to fight with nothing but his wits and a gun. And he knew something the Zirins were only now beginning to understand. War wasn't about technology. It was about adaptation. And Jack? Jack was the best there was at adapting. As the Zirins recalibrated, desperately trying to understand what was happening, Jack found a moment to rest. He leaned against a rusted car, letting out a slow breath. He wasn't naive. He knew this was just the beginning. They'd come for him. They'd send everything they had. Good. He welcomed the challenge. Somewhere, in the ruins of Earth, a lone sniper smirked, reloading his rifle. The hunt had just begun. The shot had been heard across the stars, though not in the literal sense. No explosion had rocked the atmosphere, no seismic event had registered. But the moment that Zirin officer hit the ground, the entire war shifted. Jack Holloway didn't need an official announcement to know it. The sudden silence from the invading forces, the way their formations crumbled into disarray, it was all he needed. He had cracked open the illusion of their invincibility, and now fear was creeping into the cracks. The Zirin High Command didn't panic, not yet. At first, they tried to rationalize the deaths. Perhaps it had been a malfunction, an internal failure. Perhaps their officer had stepped into an uncalculated hazard. Their shields were perfect. Their empire was perfect. There was no way some primitive human had just, what was the word the humans used? Sniped? Ridiculous. Then the second body fell, and the third. And then a fourth, with a clean hole through the forehead, and their perfect shields had still done nothing. Jack grinned to himself as he settled into his new vantage point, the remnants of a collapsed overpass providing him ample cover. The Zirins were fast learners, he had to give them that. Already, they had adapted their formations, spreading out so that his shots couldn't take out multiple targets at once. They had deployed those damn drones, though he had taken care of a couple. But the real sign that they were taking him seriously? The shift in their communication. Before, they had broadcasted their arrogance, demanding surrender. Now, they spoke in hushed, frantic tones, scrambling for solutions. He was already in their heads. Commander Vorik stood amidst his troops, watching the battlefield with unreadable eyes. He was livid, but he was no fool. This wasn't a random stroke of luck. This was a calculated attack from a trained marksman, and worse, the human had figured something out about their technology. Shields that could withstand energy-based weapons, could stop explosions and deflect laser fire, were now proving useless against simple kinetic projectiles. It was unthinkable. "Find the human," he growled, his voice carrying an edge of something rarely heard in Zirin military ranks. Frustration. "I want his corpse in front of me within the hour." His soldiers spread out, advancing with greater caution now. The blind arrogance was gone, replaced by something Jack recognized all too well. Doubt. Jack steadied his breathing, shifting slightly in his position. He wasn't concerned about being found just yet, but he also wasn't foolish enough to assume he could keep this up forever. They were going to adjust. They always did. That was the way of war. For now, though, he had an advantage. The Zirins were built for overwhelming force, not precision. They had conquered countless worlds, but they had done so by marching in, absorbing whatever resistance was thrown at them, and overpowering it with sheer technological might. Their shields had made them invincible, until now. They had never fought an enemy who could punch through them with something as simple as a well-placed bullet. Jack adjusted his sights, scanning for another officer. He wasn't here to rack up a body count for fun. Every shot had to mean something. He had to make them hesitate. Make them question. If he did it enough, it would slow their invasion down. If he did it perfectly, he might even turn the tide. His crosshairs settled on a Zirin lieutenant who was barking orders, trying to re-establish some semblance of command. Jack exhaled, relaxed his muscles, and pulled the trigger. The shot landed just as expected. The Zirin fell, his command cut short mid-sentence. Panic surged through the ranks once again. Jack could almost hear their thoughts. Where is he? How is he doing this? He moved immediately, slipping away from his position before they could triangulate it. He had no illusions about his odds in a direct fight. If they ever pinpointed his exact location, he'd be dead in minutes. The only reason he had lasted this long was because they were still figuring out the rules of the game he had forced them into. Back at the command post, Vorik was losing patience. His talons clicked against the side of his plasma rifle as he reviewed the scattered reports from his officers. He's moving too fast, one of his subordinates admitted. Every time we think we've found his position, he's already gone. Vorik narrowed his eyes. Then he's not working alone. It was the only logical conclusion. No single human could be covering that much ground alone. There had to be others, assisting him, providing cover, perhaps even jamming their scans. It made sense. The alternative, that a single human sniper was outmaneuvering an entire invading force, was simply too ridiculous to entertain. Jack, listening in on their communications, smirked. Let them think that. Let them believe he had an entire team backing him up. The more they overestimated his numbers, the more resources they would waste trying to track him down. But he knew he had to be careful. He had their attention now, and that meant they were going to start changing tactics. And they did. The next time he repositioned, he caught a glimpse of something new. Zirin soldiers advancing more cautiously than before, scanning the terrain differently. A subtle shift in their approach, but it was enough to tell him that they weren't just reacting anymore. They were thinking ahead. Then he saw it, a pulse. A faint, almost imperceptible distortion in the air. A trap. They had recalibrated their shields, modifying them in real time. He didn't know exactly how, but it was clear they were adapting. Jack clenched his jaw. He had been expecting this. They weren't stupid. They were slow to adjust, but when they did it fast. Fine. He pulled out his small field notebook and started sketching. If they were modifying their shields, that meant they had figured out the frequency gap issue. They would be working to eliminate those weaknesses. But that didn't mean they were perfect. Jack had fought in wars before. Every time an enemy adapted, it was only a matter of time before he found a new way to punch through. He checked his rifle, reloaded, and settled in again. The game was far from over. And if the Zirins thought they were close to catching him, they were about to be sorely disappointed. The Zirins were learning. That much was clear. Jack watched through his scope as they moved differently now, abandoning the rigid formations they had relied on earlier. They spread out, kept their heads lower, and staggered their movements to avoid being predictable. They were no longer marching with the arrogant certainty of an unstoppable force. Now they were hunting. And the thing about hunters? They got desperate when the prey fought back harder than expected. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and shifted his position yet again. He couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. He had kept ahead of them so far, but he could feel them closing in, adjusting their methods. The first mistake had been underestimating human weapons. The second mistake had been assuming they could simply overwhelm the problem with numbers. But now, they had begun strategizing. That was bad news. He saw them setting up scanning devices, small pulsating beacons that sent waves through the rubble and debris. Heat sensors, movement trackers, smart. They were casting a net, shrinking his playground inch by inch. Jack let out a slow breath. If they thought they could corral him like an animal, they were in for another rude awakening. A group of Zirin soldiers advanced toward what had been an old police station. They were cautious, rifles raised, their shields shimmering faintly. Jack had taken down enough of them to know that the shields weren't perfect, but now they were tuned differently. He noticed the faint hum, a frequency modulation that hadn't been present before. That meant the weak points had shifted. He had to figure out where. And fast. He adjusted his aim, lining up a shot at one of the officers who seemed to be directing the squad. His finger hovered over the trigger, but then something caught his eye, movement to the right, something too small to be one of the soldiers. A drone. Sleeker than the last ones he had encountered. It floated effortlessly, scanning the area with rapid bursts of blue light. Jack knew instantly that if he fired now, it would pinpoint him in seconds. Damn, they were getting smarter. Jack exhaled through his nose and carefully retracted his rifle, crawling backward along the ruined concrete. He had to rethink his approach. If they were actively countering his shots, he couldn't just rely on picking them off one by one. He needed to start dictating the fight on his own terms. As he moved through the wreckage of the city, he heard the distant echo of Zirin voices. They weren't panicked anymore. They were organized, confident. That wasn't good. He needed a new advantage, something they wouldn't expect. Then, as if answering his thoughts, his radio crackled to life. It was a secure frequency, one he hadn't used since the invasion started. His brows furrowed as he slowly brought it to his ear. "Human sniper," a voice said, low and deliberate. "Do not be alarmed. I am not your enemy." Jack stiffened. The voice wasn't human. It had that distinct, layered resonance of a Zirin, but there was something off about it. It lacked the usual arrogance, the condescending superiority he had come to associate with their kind. "Who the hell is this?" Jack murmured, keeping his voice low. "My name is Skull," the voice responded. "I am, let us say, an outcast. A scientist. I have been monitoring your work. I wish to propose an alliance." Jack frowned. An alliance? That was new. "Why the hell would I trust a Zirin?" he asked. There was a brief pause before Skull responded. "Because I despise what my people have become. And because if you do not listen, you will be dead within the next hour." Jack didn't like that. He had survived this long by assuming that no one had an upper hand on him, but if this Zirin was right, it meant the game had shifted even further against him. "All right," Jack muttered. "I'm listening." Skull wasted no time. "They have changed their shielding algorithm. Your bullets will no longer penetrate in the same way. They have also deployed counter-snipers, bio-enhanced soldiers bred for precision combat. They are tracking you now. If you stay where you are, you will not live to see the next sunrise." Jack clenched his jaw. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it worse. He glanced through his scope again, scanning the skyline. The thought of Zirin snipers made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of long-range fire. "What's your angle?" Jack asked. "Why help me?" Skull hesitated before answering. "Because your people are not the first my empire has crushed," he said. "And because I have seen what happens to those who submit. The Zirin Empire does not conquer to rule. It conquers to erase. Your species will not be enslaved, nor will it be given a chance to surrender. They will eliminate you entirely and rewrite history as though you never existed. If you wish to change that, you need more than just a rifle." Jack let the words settle. He had suspected this was more than just an invasion, but hearing it from a Zirin himself made it real. He didn't have the luxury of mistrust right now. If Skull was playing him, he'd deal with that later. "What do you got for me?" Jack asked. Skull's voice grew urgent. "A weakness. Not in the shields, but in their sensory technology. The scanning drones rely on thermal tracking, but they are still calibrated to detect high-energy weapons. Your rifle has been difficult for them to track because it is primitive by their standards. But if you use fire, heat signatures, you can create false positives, scramble their tracking. It will buy you time. Jack considered that. It wasn't a bad idea. If he could misdirect them, make them think he was in multiple places at once, he could stay ahead of their snipers. I can work with that, Jack muttered. Anything else? Yes, Skal said. Their commander, Vorik, is beginning to understand you. He is adapting to you specifically. If you wish to win, you must become unpredictable. Jack exhaled slowly, staring out at the ruins before him. Unpredictable. He had spent his life being one step ahead of his enemies, but now he was facing something entirely different. He had rattled the Zirins, but in doing so, he had made himself their primary target. Where can I find you? Jack asked. There was another pause, then Skal answered. I will contact you when the time is right. For now, stay alive. The radio cut off. Jack sat in silence for a moment, processing everything. The Zirins were closing in. The old tricks wouldn't work much longer. He needed to hit them in a way they didn't expect. Unpredictable. Jack's lips curled into a grin. He had an idea. Let them come. The sky burned with the fires of war, streaks of plasma lighting up the ruined cityscape as the Zirins pushed harder than ever before. Jack crouched low, his rifle resting against a shattered pillar, scanning the movements of his enemy through the night vision scope. The stakes had changed. This wasn't about wearing them down anymore. This was about survival. Skal's warning echoed in his mind. Vorik wasn't just adapting, he was hunting him personally. That meant this battle had turned into something far more dangerous than just an invasion. It was a game of minds now, and Jack had to make sure he played it better than the arrogant alien warlord. He had spent the last few hours planting heat sources all around the city, broken down vehicles rigged to burn at specific intervals, makeshift explosives designed not for damage but to disrupt the Zirin scanners. The first time one of the new drones locked onto a fire and started tracking it as a target, Jack knew he had them. The counter-snipers were good, that much he could tell. He had already spotted at least 2 of them taking up positions on the high-rise skeletons that still loomed over the broken city. He had barely escaped their first attempt to take him down, but he had learned something in the process. They were precise, but they were still relying on the same faulty tech the rest of the Zirin military used. They were assuming he operated like one of their own assassins, moving from one calculated perch to the next, following predictable patterns. That was their mistake. Jack didn't move like a sniper anymore. He moved like a ghost. His first counterattack came fast. He let them think they had him pinned, waited until the moment one of their snipers took a shot, then fired a round through the faint glint of their scope reflection. The Zirin sniper's body tumbled from its perch, a dull thud echoing against the streets below. The second counter-sniper didn't make the same mistake. Jack knew he was being watched now, knew they were adapting moment by moment, but that was the trick. He had to stay ahead of them. He had to make sure that every time they thought they understood him, he changed. The radio crackled to life again. Skal's voice came through, urgent but calm. They are closing in on your position, human. Vorik himself is entering the battlefield. Jack felt his heartbeat steady. This was what he had been waiting for. Good, Jack muttered. Let's end this. Through his scope, he saw them coming. Zirin elite troops, different from the ones he had been picking off before. Their armor was heavier, their shields reinforced, and they moved with a purpose that the others had lacked. They weren't scared anymore. They were ready to kill him. Jack exhaled slowly. He took the first shot before they had even fully spread out. A carefully aimed round right at the knee joint of the lead soldier. The shield shimmered, and for a moment Jack thought it would hold, but then, just like before, the bullet slipped through the frequency gap, shattering the joint. The Zirin collapsed, howling in pain. The others reacted immediately, their plasma rifles lighting up the night. Jack was already moving. He slid down the remains of a collapsed floor, hitting the ground hard but rolling to absorb the impact. He had only seconds before they recalibrated, and he needed to get ahead of them. The next explosion wasn't from him. It was from Skull. Somewhere in the shadows, the rogue Zirin had planted his own diversions, crude but effective explosives that sent shockwaves through the streets, confusing the enemy's sensors even further. Jack used the chaos to reposition, slipping through the remains of an old subway entrance, moving fast and low. Vorik's voice suddenly boomed through the air, amplified through his soldiers' comms. "Enough of these games, human! Face me!" Jack grinned despite himself. He saw him now, standing in the center of the battlefield like a true warlord, flanked by his most elite guards. His armor was thicker than the others, and his energy shield pulsed in a strange, erratic rhythm. Jack knew better than to assume it was faulty. No, Vorik had done something different, something designed to counter him specifically. Jack took a deep breath. This was it. He steadied his aim, lined up his shot, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet never made it. The shield reacted in a way Jack had never seen before, bending the trajectory just enough to deflect the round harmlessly into the rubble. Vorik didn't even flinch. He simply turned, locking his cold alien eyes onto Jack's position. Damn! Jack barely had time to move before the plasma shots came, tearing through the walls around him. He dove, rolling behind cover as the air filled with burning light. The ground sizzled where the shots landed, and Jack knew that if even one of them hit him, he'd be vaporized instantly. He needed a new approach. Skull's voice came through again, fast and urgent. "His shield operates on a randomized distortion pattern. You will not break it conventionally." Jack gritted his teeth. "Then what do you suggest?" There was a pause, then Skull responded. "His shield must deactivate for him to fire his own weapon. That is your opening." Jack felt his grin return. That was all he needed to know. He grabbed the old revolver strapped to his belt. It was a relic, something he had carried not for practicality but for sentiment. A piece of the past, a reminder of the warriors that had come before him. And now? Now it was going to kill a god. He stood up, fully exposing himself. Vorik reacted instantly, raising his plasma rifle. Jack moved faster. The moment the shield flickered off, Jack pulled the trigger. The revolver roared. The bullet was slower than the others, not nearly as advanced, but it didn't need to be. It found its target, right between Vorik's 4 eyes. The Zirin commander staggered, his body locking up as blue blood spattered across his troops. For the first time since the invasion began, the leader of the Zirin forces fell to his knees. Silence. Then chaos. The Zirin forces, seeing their leader collapse, broke. The remaining elite troops hesitated, the discipline they had clung to now shattered. Some ran. Some screamed in rage. But it didn't matter. The battle was over. Jack stood over Vorik's body, breathing hard. He watched as the once proud commander gasped, his mandibles twitching weakly. "You are an insect," Vorik whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack knelt down, looking him in the eyes. "Yeah," he said. "And you got squashed." Vorik exhaled one last breath, then fell still. The war wasn't over, not yet. The Zirin still had ships in orbit, still had forces on the ground. But without their leader, they were lost. Jack turned, raising his rifle one last time. It was time to finish what he started. The battlefield was eerily silent. The moment Vorik's body hit the ground, it was as if a switch had been flipped across the entire Zirin army. The invincible conquerors, the warlords who had swept through the galaxy without opposition, stood frozen in disbelief. Their leader, their symbol of superiority, lay lifeless at the feet of a human with an antique revolver. The battle had been raging just moments ago, plasma fire scorching the ruins of the city, but now, only the distant hum of their ships in the sky remained. They had never prepared for this. They had never imagined it was even possible. Jack Holloway felt the weight of the moment, but didn't let it slow him down. He scanned the battlefield, searching for any sign of movement. He knew better than to assume they would all surrender at once. Some of them might run, but others, the loyalists, the zealots, would fight to avenge their fallen commander. The war wasn't won yet. He reloaded his rifle with steady hands, watching as confusion turned to chaos among the Zirin ranks. The first shot rang out from their side, wild and desperate. It wasn't aimed at anything in particular, just a panicked attempt to reassert dominance. A younger soldier, clearly shaken, fired his plasma rifle into the air before turning it toward Jack. The shot missed, burning a molten scar into the rubble beside him. Jack reacted instantly, raising his rifle and taking the shot without hesitation. The Zirin's body crumpled, his weapon slipping from his grip. That was enough to tip the scales. The Zirins had spent their entire existence believing they were the superior species. They had never truly known fear, never tasted the possibility of defeat. But the sight of their commander's body, the realization that their shields were not perfect, that their war machines could be undone by something as simple as a well-placed bullet, cracked something deep inside them. The formation they had held so rigidly collapsed. Some turned and fled, abandoning their positions, running toward their extraction points. Others hesitated, looking to each other for guidance that was no longer there. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired again, taking out another officer who had been barking orders. Without leadership, the rest of them crumbled faster. One by one, they dropped their weapons and ran. The Zirin Empire was vast, and they had faced resistance before, but never like this. They had always believed themselves untouchable, above the struggles of lesser species. Now they knew better. Scoffed's voice crackled through Jack's radio. "You did it, human! You killed their god!" Jack didn't have time to celebrate. "They're retreating, but that won't last. They still have ships in orbit." Scoffed hesitated before answering. "Not for long. Without Vorik, their war council will hesitate. They will not risk full planetary destruction without leadership. The invasion is collapsing." Jack knew he was right. The Zirin war machine functioned on precision and chain of command. Without a clear leader, their forces would be thrown into disarray. That gave humanity a window, a small one, to turn the tide completely. He moved through the wreckage, picking off stragglers as he went. He wasn't alone anymore. As soon as the tide turned, the remaining human resistance fighters emerged from their hiding places, emboldened by the sudden shift. They had been barely holding on, hiding in the ruins, but now, with the Zirins on the run, they surged forward, reclaiming what they had lost. Gunfire erupted around him as human forces fought with renewed determination, driving the invaders out of the city. Jack knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something else. The Zirins would not forget this humiliation. Even if they retreated, even if they abandoned the invasion for now, they would come back. The Empire would not tolerate weakness, and the fact that a single sniper had shattered their illusion of superiority would shake them to their core. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, there was still work to do. Jack pushed forward, making his way toward the last known Zirin command outpost in the city. If they were truly retreating, he needed to ensure they didn't have time to regroup. He needed to cut off their ability to call for reinforcements. As he moved through the shattered streets, he spotted a cluster of Zirin officers in the distance, desperately trying to activate a long-range communications array. If they got a message out, if they sent a distress signal to the larger fleet, the retreat could be reversed. They might even launch a final attack out of desperation. Jack adjusted his scope, measuring the wind, the distance, everything. He had one shot to stop them before they sent their signal. His heart slowed, his breathing evened out, and he pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the lead officer's skull, sending the others into a frenzy. They scrambled, trying to finish their transmission, but Jack fired again. And again. By the time he was done, the console was destroyed, the officers lay dead, and the last hope of the Zirin forces in this sector had been wiped out. Scoffed's voice came through again, urgent. "You've done it, human! Their fleet is already disengaging. They are abandoning the operation." Jack let out a slow breath. He had been fighting for so long that victory almost didn't seem real. But there it was. The impossible had happened. The Zirins were leaving. He stepped out into the open, watching as the last of their transport crafts lifted off. He could see the fear in their retreat, the way they moved with desperation rather than order. Humanity had been meant to be a footnote in their conquest. Instead, it had become the lesson they would never forget. The resistance fighters around him cheered, voices rising up through the smoke and dust. People who had been running for their lives just hours ago now stood victorious. Jack, however, simply watched. He had been in too many wars to celebrate just yet. Scoffed's voice softened. You know they will return. Jack nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of his rifle. Yeah. But next time, they won't underestimate us. He turned, stepping away from the battlefield as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The war wasn't over, not really. It never was. But today, humanity had proven something. They weren't helpless. They weren't weak. And if the Zirins ever came back, they wouldn't be facing frightened civilians and outdated weapons. They would be facing the species that had killed their commander, shattered their illusions, and made their gods bleed. Jack walked into the ruins, his rifle resting on his shoulder. Let them come.